Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Cybersecurity for Startups webinar with Mike Tirico from Beckage Law Firm. Thank you for taking the time today, Mike, to share all your cybersecurity knowledge with us today for startup companies and more. This meeting is for everybody's knowledge, this meeting is being recorded for educational purposes. Just as a reminder, everybody, please mute your lines. If you cannot see the webinar or you have difficulty hearing us, please just write in the chat box. And then thank you for those that did send questions over that we received. We will be pulling a name at random to receive a Launch New York swag bag, so congratulations. All of you are welcome to submit your questions in the chat box during the webinar, and they will be addressed at the end of the webinar. And I would like to thank you all for being here today. And with that, I will hand it over to Launch New York CEO, Marnie Levine.
Hi, all. Welcome. So glad you could join us today. I know many webinars happening, but at this time, can't imagine a topic more important than cybersecurity. We really appreciate Mike joining us today. Mike is an attorney with the Beckage Law Firm, and he is a certified information officer and former ISO. He has worked with global clients to develop their privacy and security programs, and now he handles the risk management practice at Beckage Firm. So whether you're thinking about, what are the areas that you need to tend to, or you have specific questions or concerns, or perhaps are even part of an audit strategy that you're developing, Mike is really a terrific go-to to make sure clients are really on track with their technology and their legal postures as it relates to information technology and data security. So we're really pleased to have Mike join us, particularly because it supports our mission of assisting high growth potential companies in addressing the myriad issues that you face, from fundraising to building your organization, getting your product to market, and the cybersecurity not only around your product, but also around your organization. We are featuring many topics, as you know, on an ongoing basis through these webinar formats. We do encourage you to keep an eye out for our weekly Investor Network webinars, which is part of the fundraising side of our house, where we provide not only our nonprofit seed fund access, but also a whole new host of for-profit programs. Many of you are trying to respond to the COVID crisis, and we hope you're all well and safe. And we really appreciate the resilience that we are seeing among our client companies who comprise a good portion of the folks joining today. We know that cybersecurity ends up really being a top-of-mind issue now as much as ever. So we are looking forward to a chance to not only hear from Mike, but Mike is also happy to take questions. So we do encourage that in addition to the questions we received in advance, we do encourage you to type your questions into the chat box, and Jackie will assist in providing those to Mike after he's given his formal presentation. I want to also thank Jackie Delaneva is our marketing coordinator who set the program up for today, and Mike Tirico, of course, who actually, if any of you tuned in, did a Twitter chat with us on the cybersecurity topic starting last week as a phenomenal way to lead into today's program. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Mike.
Thank you, Marnie. Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate you guys inviting me to speak today. Whenever I do these sort of things, I say, wow, an hour, I have so much to talk about and so little time here. So I just encourage people to save questions till the end, and I'm going to jump right in. So, keep your hands in the vehicle at all times here because we're going to move along somewhat quickly. But nonetheless, I also wanted to give, the disclaimer, the obligatory attorney disclaimer that I'm not your attorney, right? Anyone who's listening here, the information that I'm sharing is really just of a goodwill nature, and I would encourage you for any type of questions that that involve legal risk to consult with your attorneys. With that, I'm going to again, they mentioned who I am. I don't want to really spend much time on this. You could look me up on our Beckage website. You'll see that I do have quite a bit of experience in information systems. I am a technologist at heart. I've continually kind of walked the line of attorney, technologist, operations, legal. I'm passionate about this stuff, and I think that you'll find that some of the material that I'm covering today is really kind of goes at it at a little bit of a different angle. Additionally, Beckage, you can look us up on our website. But we do really, typically what we say is we have 4 different buckets, right? We have 4 different areas or places where we practice, and regulatory compliance, of course, and we do quite a bit of policy drafting and strategizing for taxonomies of policies and procedures, and practices. Contract review. You could read this slide. I think everyone will be getting this slide deck after, but you'll see that we're also heavily involved in incident response, litigation, risk management. Risk management is kind of where I play, so to speak, and I'll be talking quite a bit about risk management, technology risk management in this presentation. So what I typically like to do is start with a somewhat of a crawl, walk, run type of an approach to all of this. I don't have the benefit of saying, hey, by a show of hands, how many, but typically what I like to do is ask some questions about how big of an organization, get a feel for my audience. But I establish these types of presentations in a crawl, walk, run type of an approach here. You'll find, forgive me if some of this material seems a little bit elementary, but I'd like to kind of build upon the material as I go. So with that, I will continue on and start with where we are, as a society, as an industry, and I've built this slide to kind of show us a balance of the us and them, right? Who, us being the providers or whatever it is, companies, entities that we are, startups, and there's a regulatory landscape really that has proved to be beneficial to some extent. It is driving the conversation. It's driving our posture, internal postures around cybersecurity, right? It's requiring an executive intimacy, if you will. So an executive intimacy, what I mean by that is really just a better, firmer understanding of cybersecurity and the risks that are facing our organizations. And it's also, consequently required an increase in spend. Frankly, we're seeing organizations spend some more money. Now, I kind of couch that with the, how lucrative of a business hacking is, right? And on the other side, we see this $242 per record, right? That's a stolen record on the black market is going on average for around $242. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the later slides. In healthcare, the number is exponentially more, right? It's almost double, right? So at 408, you can see why healthcare is hit so hard. There's other reasons why healthcare is hit so hard by hackers, but or attackers, as I like to call them. But it's quite a lucrative industry for them. You'll in turn see that there's been a year over year 98% increase in cyber attacks, and spear phishing attacks is really a hot ticket item right now, and I'll chat a little bit more about that as well. So you can see here, right, the balance here, right, and we're kind of losing the battle in some ways, but awareness is key, and getting the conversations going internally. You'll see a lot of regulatory language now around privacy and security by design, right, and that's a hot topic right now in our space, right, and kind of building into the fabric of everything that you do an eye towards cybersecurity and privacy. Right. What happens here, right? The cost of a data breach, what's driving all of this really, right? There's 3 costs. And when I'm doing this in person, I'll typically ask for a show of hands, and I'll just show the 3 R's and then proceed to show, the recovery costs, the regulatory costs, and the third cost here, right? The one that most people forget about is the reputational cost. And that's probably the most significant. Right? Recovery costs include everything from bringing in forensic firms, right, trying to recover data that may have been lost, trying to understand where the bad guys may have gone, what data have they touched, have they exfiltrated data, have they accessed data, right? So those sort of things. And then, of course, trying to recover your data. Okay, so that kind of leads us, of course, right into the present moment here, right? Last week I was chatting online on Twitter about, just the real threats of distributed workforce, right? The new world reality, or new world order that we have here, and the conversations are flowing right now around. Well, they've been flowing for weeks now around how do we do this? How do we shift to 100% distributed workforce, right? Well, I think now the conversations are starting. I actually was privy to one today with an executive who was saying, wow, we're doing pretty good with this distributed workforce. We're starting conversations now around changing our model, our business model here. And, and the kind of the cost savings that can be incurred by allowing people to work from home. But there's this new expanded threat surface, right? So we move everybody home to work remotely, and we've exponentially increased our threat surface. And now we're using these tools, right? These household tools like Zoom, and that's the big one everyone's seeing in the news now all the time. I felt a little bit bad about jumping on Zoom here, but I did want to point this out. I read this just a couple of days ago, and I added this last minute. Over 500,000 Zoom account credentials have been found on the dark web. Okay, so it makes you start to think twice about using tools like this. Right, and what can we do to secure our tools, right? And there's a list of things that you can do, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, right? But you'll see that it wasn't just personal Zoom accounts, right? There was banks and educational institutions included, right? And then there's this thing called credential stuffing. And credential stuffing is really just people who generally use the same username, email account and password across all of their accounts. Right, so a bad guy is, if he's able to determine what your credentials are for one account, naturally he's going to look to see, or she's going to look to see if they can use those same credentials on other services that you may have, banking or work or educational accounts, things of that nature. Things to all be aware of. Right, again, domain spoofing. Right, this is front and center now. Right, and this is an interesting statistic here, but there's just been this tremendous increase in domains being registered. Right, hundreds of thousands of new domains being registered in the last 2 months. Right, and you'll see things like Google Classroom, right, spoofing the domain, and you'll see below here impersonated by Google with an O before Classroom. Right, so you could see kind of the methods here, the indicators of compromise, as we like to call them. Right. This is an interesting little story here, and I'm kind of moving along quickly, like I promised I would. But this is all that I wanted to share. I probably should have shared from the very beginning that everything that I present here is in the public domain. I would never ever risk sharing anything that was confidential. Anybody can go and look at domain registrations, right, and registration information. This was an interesting story. I had a gentleman who worked for me, who's a security analyst, come to me and say, Mike, I think you ought to see this. It was like a scene out of a movie. And he said, I was just doing a little bit of research on our medical, on our hospital. And, the hospital had changed names, and, it was under a new name. And he was looking up the old hospital name, BergenRegionalMedicalCenter.com, and he found that it was registered. All right, so it was released by the hospital, and it had since been registered by someone in, as you can see below, registrant contact information. Look at that, Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam. Right, so eye-opening, right? You oftentimes would say, do you think there's a BergenRegionalMedicalCenter.com or a Bergen Regional Medical Center in Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam? Probably not, right? So what does that tell us, right? Again, I'm pointing this out just to show you the current threat landscape that we live in. These things are real, right? That these things extend beyond our national borders here, right? The bad guys are around the world, right? I'd love to show real screenshots here, right? And again, I have not divulged anything I could, that is, private information here. This shows you, right? As an information security officer, one of the screens that I would look at on a daily basis here, and you'll see user login failed. I mean, typically information security officers, right, are able to monitor the behavior of their users, right? See how many times they're trying to log into accounts. Well, here we see where they're logging in from. These user login failed are coming from all over the world here. We see that by the IP address, right? And forgive me if this seems elementary, but I think it's good to show. Russia, Iran, Brazil, very real threats from around the world trying to get into a little medical center's accounts. Additionally, right, you'll see here another real screenshot, right? A malware, malicious software attempts to deliver malware to a network, right? On a daily basis, these threats just continually come in every day, right? So am I scaring everyone? I guess I hope so on some level. So anyway, I'm going to keep moving along here. I'm from New Jersey. I live in New Jersey, born and raised in New Jersey. There was an interesting case, and it kind of, I think, highlights just, again, this current threat landscape that we live in and things that we have to be aware of as we grow our businesses, as we build our businesses. We bring on business associates or business relationships, right? We have vendors that we use. We have to, on some level, build a security posture that not only protects our immediate network, but also evaluates those that we're doing business with. If we're going to be entrusting a vendor with private information or non-public information, we need to do our due diligence, right, to better understand how they're protecting that information. This case took it even a step further. It was a medical practice. They had a vendor, but their vendor, unbeknownst to them, was outsourcing some of the work to a firm in India, and that firm in India had a breach. They didn't even know about it. So this was an interesting case. You could probably Google it. It was a medical group in New Jersey in 2018. That was. But here, I think that what I'm highlighting here is the costs, right? I mentioned earlier the 3 R's, regulatory, recovery costs, and reputation. Well, look at this, right? They got hit over $400,000 settlement. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving along here, and business email compromise, BEC as it's referred to, has had just tremendous proliferation in the last 2 years. You've seen this. You could Google business email compromise. Typically, what it looks like is a phishing email or a spoofed email of a coworker, right? You'll see a CEO. You may get an email from your CEO. If you're in payroll, and it says, hey, can you change my direct deposit information? Unbeknownst to them, it's really not the CEO, right? It's a spoofed email, just trying to get somebody to obviously act on the request and, lo and behold, steal money. So these are I oftentimes will say, for the most part, organizations, if a breach is going to happen, just looking at the statistics, it's most likely going to happen through a phishing email, through one of your end users clicking on a link or opening an attachment, right? That then delivers malware, compromises non-public information. All right, and so here's some points here. You could see, I'm not going to read these verbatim, but there are things that you can do to protect against business email compromise, and they don't necessarily have to be technical controls in place. They could be operational controls. What's the workflow? Looking at your workflow around changing account information, things of that nature. Okay. So I'm going to move along here, and so I start with scaring everyone naturally, and it seems bleak after looking at those sort of things, and then I pile on a little bit more, and I do like to say, in order for us to be informed and to have these conversations about how to protect our data, how to protect our customers' information, our assets, if you will, I'd like to also look at the attacker. Right? Who are they? In order for us to defend and to fight them, I think we need to understand who they are. Right? And I mentioned assets, and I was kind of thinking, I oftentimes will point out and focus on these, technical assets that we have, right, and data. right? And we have hardware, right? We have laptops, we have endpoints, right? Servers, things of that nature. There's another asset that our organizations have, and that's our employees, right? And so I come at this from different angles. We can do everything we can, right, to protect our hardware, to protect our hard assets with technical controls. Likewise, we can protect our soft assets, I'll call them, right, our personnel, our employees, by educating them, right? Having a robust curriculum, ongoing education is key. Right. So we have this world, I've been talking about the new world order, the world that we live in, and there's these increasing complexities. And I always love to point out that we have, the original space shuttle was really 415,000 lines of code to get that behemoth of a piece of machinery up into orbit, right? The Apollo capsule ran on less memory than your iPhone. The car that we drive into work when we do go back to work, right, into our workplaces, has 100 million lines. Average car has 100 million lines of code. We live in this incredibly complex world. Have you heard Internet of Things, right? In our homes, you could look at almost any device that you have in your home now, electronic device, and it has some computer capabilities to it, some computing capabilities to it. Funny story. I had bought a new washer and dryer, and it broke after 1 year. I was having problems. We had a technician come in, and he had a USB plugged in. He was able to tell me how many loads of laundry we did in the last year. Pretty amazing. So we have, we look to our workplaces now, right? And we say, wow, we live in these incredible, and if you don't yet, you have to build you're a startup. You need to have an eye towards, where we're going as an organization and build, as I mentioned earlier, by design, right? Privacy and security by design. And that extends to all facets of your organization. Every conversation you have in your organization should have an eye towards privacy and security. If not because it's just the right thing to do, because it's from a regulatory standpoint, it's mandated most of the time, right? So we have hundreds and hundreds of systems at our average organization that we work at, and vendors and devices, right? You add all of that up, and you add the vendors in, and you start calculating how complex this is, and you have hundreds of millions of lines of code, right? So these attackers have all these different types of driving motivations. I mentioned earlier that Zoom on the black market, right, on the dark net, they have 500,000 compromised accounts. I was reading that article, and they weren't even selling; they were selling them for a fraction of a penny. It wasn't even about making money off of those accounts. What the article was purporting was that this was really about notoriety for some of these hackers and gaining some notoriety. Right? Look what I can do. Right. So you have these different types of motivations. So you do have financial. Obviously, I showed you the cost of a stolen record on the black market. Right. You have financial drivers, and you have ideology drivers and mission drivers. Right. One attack can be part of a bigger mission. I don't really have the time to get into it, but there's a medical transcription company 2 years ago that was attacked out of Massachusetts. And really, there was no financial motive to it. It was literally, I use the analogy of basically like rolling a grenade into their data center and blowing it up. The attack brought down and what they call is bricked many of their servers, like hundreds and hundreds of their servers beyond use. They couldn't even bring them back up. So it's a story for another day. But that, I believe, was a mission, probably part of a mission to see how successful this attack could be, and it's probably part of a bigger attack that will take place at some point. Okay, so what can we do? Have I just crushed everyone here? Is everyone feeling really hopeless or helpless? Well, there are key considerations here, and there are things that we have going for us, and I like to think that we're doing some great things in our field. I started with this crawl, walk, run approach, and I like to ultimately point out to people that this crawl, walk, run approach really is kind of gauging things through the lens of risk, right? And starting with risk, which is the likelihood times the impact. Simply put, right? I know that there's articles upon articles on risk and how to measure risk, and it can be quite complex. I boil it down for today's purposes. I like to say, what's the likelihood of something happening times the impact if that thing does happen, right? So it's not only required in a lot of these laws that we're seeing now, right, around security and privacy laws, right? But it really does help guide our security posture. Right? I'm not going to get into this, but in New York State there is the SHIELD Act, right, and that I believe it was March 22nd was the deadline for complying with the SHIELD Act. And that look at the language here. I kind of bolded the size and complexity of the organization. So it says, hey, yeah, you have to comply with this, and you have to have certain reasonable administrative, technical, and physical safeguards in place, right? But that can be based on, right, the size and the complexity and the sensitivity of your data, size and complexity of your organization, and the sensitivity of your data. Right? What does that mean? How do you really understand what that means? Well, that's something that we do. We help organizations determine what that is. Help right size the controls for your organization. Okay. There are things like, and this might be misplaced here, but there are things that you can do around informing conversations around password complexity requirements. National Institute of Standards and Technology is an organization that technologists typically look to, right? We look to NIST standards to help inform our posture, right? To help inform what we're doing, right? And a couple of years ago, NIST came out with this guidance that was kind of earth-shattering for a lot of people in organizations. And it said, we got this all wrong, people. This minimum of 8 characters in uppercase, lowercase, and changing it every 30, 60, 90 days, that's confusing your end users. And it's, in fact, it could be counterproductive in a way, because individuals were then dumbing down their passwords, right? How many of us have incremented our password by a 1, 2, or 3 at the end, right? That's kind of what has taken place by having these types of complexity requirements. So they did these studies, and there were these studies that came about that showed that when you increase your password length, right? Here, this image shows you 12 characters, the time to crack, using a standard password cracker, right, that are out there, right? You could Google password cracker, and anybody can go and get their hands on one of these tools that could help crack passwords. Right, but 12, if you increased your end user's password to 12 characters, it would take a year to crack, right? With a special character, 2 centuries, it says here, right? So this really helped to start to inform some conversation around low-cost types of things that we can do in our organization to help protect our assets, our people assets, right? So I encourage you not only to do this in your organizations, but to look at your personal accounts as well. Everything that I talk about here today can be applied in your home environment, right? Low-cost type things here. Remember I was talking about business email compromise? Well, there's ways that you can actually create rules that will prevent the bad guy from spoofing, right? From spoofing, your CEO or one of the executive or coworkers' accounts. And you can create a rule that says, hey, I'm not going to allow any external emails into my organization that have my users' names in the email address, in the email name, where the originating email address, right? And this has to work for your organization. I got a lot of pushback from people, from end users saying, what do you mean I can't forward something from my Gmail account then to my work account? No, you can't. Sorry. You can't do that. I apologize. If there's one-offs and you need me to make an exception, let's evaluate it. But I would not want carte blanche, somebody being able to send, I don't know who is in their personal email. I don't know what has happened to their personal email, right? Has their personal email been compromised, right? So these are the kind of things that you have to think about. And I always would start from, hey, let's tighten up this environment, right? Let's narrow this threat surface as much as we can and start there, right? Privacy, security by design. And let's start there and look, if we need to start to loosen up down the road, we can do that. I talk about this a lot the last few weeks with organizations that have been moving to a distributed workforce, right? And I say, you could you could increase the controls that you have in place, tighten things, ratchet it up. Doesn't have to be forever. It could be until we bring people back to our work environments, right? So that might look like, here, look at this, frameworks, right? I have this pyramid I created with technical, physical, administrative controls, and you'll see on the left-hand side, in looking at your screen, the types of technical, physical, and administrative controls. When you look at technical, you look at access control, audit control, right? Integrity, things of that nature. And I don't really have the time to get into all these in detail. I could probably spend an hour talking about technical controls easily. But what I'm trying to get at here is, in this time where we're in a distributed workforce scenario, you could look at things like, since we have 100% of people now, I don't know where they are, where they're working, let's tighten up screensaver timing, right? Typically, I would see I would see for our devices, screensaver kicks on after 15 minutes, or 5 minutes, and then a 15-minute session lockout, right? If you're not active in your network session 15 minutes, it's going to lock you out. Maybe you ratchet these down. Maybe you make it now, for the time being, until people come back to work, 3-minute screensaver and 8-minute session lockout times. You start adding up the amount of availability time, right, that's available for a bad guy to take advantage of that, and you could tally up that time and say, wow, we just really locked things down for many, many hours. Okay, so I'm kind of digressing here, but I would look at, again, from the technologist standpoint, this is the stuff this is how we talk. We talk in terms of confidentiality, integrity, availability, CIA, easy to remember, right? They call that the cybersecurity or information security triad, right? So great things to know, and it's kind of the new world that we live in. We're spinning up businesses now. We need to wear multiple hats, right? We need to be able to talk this language. Okay, so where does that lead us? That kind of brings us into talking about policies, procedures, practices. People start to roll their eyes at times and say, oh boy, here we go. The attorney talking about documents, talking about policies and procedures. These are living documents, right? These things, I'll call these operational documents. They should be, right? They can't just sit on a shelf, dust them off every now and then, right? And increasingly, you're seeing, right, there's regulatory requirements, right, that you're aligning your business practices with your policies. I would oftentimes say you're probably not, you're probably better off not having the documented policy, something that, you have an informal policy, than having a documented policy that you're not following, right? So we look at these things and we say, look, and I've just kind of covered this, right? You have to have relevant, timely IT security and privacy policies that are supportive of the current threat landscape. I believe that this language I may have pulled, this is going back some time, but I think that that's straight out of HIPAA, okay? Security rule. You can look it up, right? Procedures too. You must be able to demonstrate that you have procedures in place that are based on your policies. And then finally, right, you have to be able to demonstrate this stuff. If somebody was to come into your organization tomorrow and ask for evidence, provide evidence that you're doing these things. If your policy says that you're evaluating logins on your users periodically, can you demonstrate that, right? If somebody says, can you demonstrate your password complexity requirements? What are they, right? Have you performed any kind of evaluation on the controls in your environment, right? A risk assessment, right? So this stuff, I'm talking about at a high level, and this oftentimes, this is the same conversation I had before COVID-19, but it's relevant today with COVID-19. These are the things that we have to be looking at within our organizations, whether we're remote or not. So letting you in on a little secret here. Sure, there are some unique challenges and unique threats in a remote environment, but it comes down to cyber hygiene, right? It comes down to really just incorporating a good cyber hygiene into your environment. As I mentioned here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Look at these kind of high level things. I've touched on these things in an hour presentation, I can't really get into the depth that I would love to get into, and maybe that's a follow-up presentation. We can talk about technical safeguards. Or if you have an IT person in your organization that you wanted to hook up with me to talk about this stuff, I love this stuff. I'll geek out on this stuff, whenever I can. So, but I would look at these things, right? Number one, practicing good password hygiene. I talked about password complexity. Look at it, out of the box, change your default password settings, perhaps. Go take a look at them. I mentioned earlier about how this all applies at home, and I'm probably stealing some thunder from another one of my slides, but if you look at your home environment and you go look at your router, oftentimes these routers, we spin these things up and they have out of the box default username and account credentials, username and password. Have you thought about looking at that? Has it been changed? Have you updated your router? Technical safeguards, number 2, right? In your home environment. When was the last time you actually did any type of an update to your router? Now, truth be told, a lot of routers out of the box, right, have the default setting to update automatically, right, to periodically update. But I would still go and look at that for sure. Okay. And then you have these other things here, right? You need to be able to go look at your policies or create policies if you don't have them that touch on these things that consider data, right? The handling of data, right? What type of are you using encryption on your endpoints? Are you using encryption in transit, right? Believe it or not, bad guys can steal data in transit. Okay, so you need to look at these things. You have to be informed on these things. All right, policy alignment. And again, I'm kind of going through this lens of policies. Do you have policies in place? If not, you could stand them up. I oftentimes will encourage people, they don't know where to start with this. I say, go do a little research on your own around NIST, right? Go Google NIST, CSF, Cybersecurity Framework, NIST 853. It's a really robust set of controls and, questions around technical controls in NIST 853. It's, you could look at that. That's special publication 853 SP. Okay. So we have to look at safeguard, in the home environment. I'm going to pivot a little bit here to the distributed workforce. I mentioned that, there are some things that you can do in the home environment that you have to really, as an organization, look at some new considerations, right? And this all comes back to making sure that everyone who has not worked at home, right? Everyone who's now working at home understands what your policies are. Good time to refresh their memory on policies, right? Reminders. I did this, myself and another attorney at Beckett, Dan Green. He's, primarily responsible for incident response and handling and shepherding the incident response process for organizations that are oftentimes in their darkest hour, right? But he and I did somewhat of a roadshow, meeting with quite a few organizations discussing, right, considerations for moving to a remote workforce right when this all started. And there were some key themes that kind of came out of our conversations. Probably the biggest key theme was education, right? And that kind of is what drove me to create this slide here, which kind of touches on, all of these things kind of are tied to education, right? Safeguarding credentials, reminding your users about about credentials and never writing them down or having them on a Post-it on your computer, taking pictures. How many times now are you seeing in LinkedIn people taking pictures of their home office, right? It's lighthearted, but every time I see one of those pictures, I cringe and I say, oh, please, I hope there isn't a little Post-it with a username and password on their screen. And even more so, as an attacker or bad guy, right? Even if I know that, oh, okay, so I see that Joe Smith works for this, company A, and I see that they're in Office 365. I see that on his computer, or I see some sort of a platform that they use. Now I'm starting to build a little bit of a profile about this person as a bad guy, right? There's a term called social engineering. And all of these little things, all these little bits of information about our workers at home, right, can start to create a profile which could help a bad guy launch an attack on your organization. All right. So users should have no expectation of privacy. Do they know that? Right. It's a good time to remind them, even in the comforts of their own home, when they log in, they VPN in, they log into any of these applications that your organization uses, or I take it a step further and say, they're on your device. If you've given them a laptop, they have no expectation of privacy, right? Remind them, right? Email, never used for personal use. I touched on that earlier, saying that, hey, people should not be forwarding from their personal webmail to their work mail account. Likewise, people should never, ever have an auto forward on from their work email to their home email. And you might see that in this kind of work from home environment, right? So I would remind them, right, of the dangers of doing something like that. All right, so I really don't have the time. I'm doing a time check here. I'm at 1:40, so I have about 20 minutes here. I'm going to keep moving along here. I'd like to get to just some of this is a good one. I typically will, when I have the time, talk about, I wanted to put all of this stuff into a presentation, realizing that I'm not going to really have the time to talk about it all, but you will be receiving, I believe that you will be receiving these slides. You'll have access to this. These are always, like I always say, if you're not an IT-focused person, right, that's not your role, or tangentially you do have a hand in it, I would say bring back these nuggets of information to your IT folks. Start the conversations. Look at this, what I call the operational dirty dozen, right? And this really touches on, right, regulatory enforcement, right? If they were to come in, typically this is what you would see. And I could safely say across most, most regulatory bodies that these are the things, big hit items here that they're going to look at. Look at number one, business associate management. Oftentimes in healthcare, we call it business associate, it's vendor management. Big ticket item here. What are you doing to evaluate your vendors that you're doing business with? Anything? Do you have any type of questionnaire for them? We have to look at these things, right? We have to look at, education, right? I'm touching on education for the remote worker, but, it's a great time. People who are starting up companies are in such a great position to start to build out a cybersecurity or information security framework and make that a part of the fabric of their organization from the beginning. How many times I've worked with companies that have been around for 25, 30, 40 years, it's so difficult to build that culture, not only the culture, but the controls too. There's this notion of, right, legacy problems, right? So new organizations have some great opportunities to build, to touch on all of these operational controls, right? So, I touched on remote workforce and how we really encourage best practice. How do we inform these users now that they're working from home? And we have this kind of cyclical thing that I created here around remote workforce essentials, right? And making cybersecurity training, right, integral, not only for new users, but ongoing. Do you have that in place? Now's a great time to start if you don't, right? And you could start kicking it off with, working from home and what's required of you working from home, right? One of the big challenges for a lot of organizations is say, yeah, we have a lot of these great controls in place and we have some great policies in place. We do phishing campaigns, but then an phishing campaign is really just testing your users to see if they fall for, like a fraudulent email, like clicking on a link or opening an attachment, right? And how many times has an organization had repeat offenders and they continually fail time and time again, right? Is there any type of a disciplinary policy in place, right? Oftentimes we'll say policy is only as effective as it is enforceable, right? So you need to be able to not only have these policies, but do you have any type of a progressive disciplinary policy in place? Something to look at here, right? Again, I mentioned earlier, I'm an attorney, but I wear this risk hat, right? This technology risk management hat. And so most of the stuff I'm talking about here is really nuts and bolts risk management, right? And, certainly don't need to be a cybersecurity expert, right? So I'm going to move along here and just talk, at a high level, right? There's just these day-to-day risks that we have to address. And some of these things can be easy fixes. Look, at my organization, I was proud to address what I call as low-hanging fruit. I talked a little bit earlier about spoofing, right? Getting that fraudulent email that looks like it's from one of your coworkers, right? Well, there's ways that you can put a banner. Does your organization have a yellow or a bright colored banner or some alarming, text in the body of the email that says, hey, this email is coming from outside the organization? External banners is quite effective. Sure, you run the risk of, what I'll call as like alarm fatigue, right? People learn, after a while, just look right past that language. But it's quite effective if, somebody in my organization got an email from me that came from outside the organization. It should raise the red flag. Hey, Mike is sending me an email, but he's an internal guy here. Why am I getting this external message from him, right? So we need to look at that sort of stuff. Does your organization block, any type of communications from outside the country? Now, naturally, you have to do some kind of a business analysis. Can we, right? Will that affect our business or our availability, right? CIA, remember, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Will it affect the availability of data for us, such that it could be prohibitive to our organization? But I would look at what they call is geofencing, geography fencing here, right? Geographical fencing, blocking things from rogue, what I'll call like the more rogue countries. Do you not do business with Russia? There's no way, no how that you should allow any communications to come in, right, from IPs from Russia, right? So you could look, and we did that. You could start crawl, walk, run. Start with some of the more notorious, North Korea, China, Russia, right? Look at those countries and block them outright. Okay, so I'm throwing a lot of information at you here, and I'm hoping that this is helpful for you. These are what I call little nuggets of information you could bring back to your IT folks and ask them if, hey, are we doing this? Right? Updating. Okay, so here's some good timely stuff here for you, right? I mentioned earlier that, tips when working from home, right? I talked about, your router at home and making sure it's updated. I would look at your Wi-Fi connection too. Is it secure, right? Do you have a secure Wi-Fi? Your SSID, that you log in to, are you using some anonymous name here, right? You might want to do that. You could create different, Wi-Fi networks, right, at home, right? So you could have a guest network, right? So these are little things that you should be looking at for your workers and asking if they have these things in place. It's certainly, I would argue that it's well within your right to put that on them, to make sure that their environment is secure, right? If you're not providing devices to them, they're using their own devices. Do you have a bring your own device policy, BYOD policy in place? Right, that helps to inform what they need to have in place, right? Are they attesting to having certain things in place on their devices, the latest software versions on their devices, right? Things of that nature. Two-factor authentication, this bottom one, I probably should have that up at the top. That's probably the most important thing, I would say, for you and your organizations to start with. Two-factor authentication. When your users are logging into their email accounts, are they required to not only provide their password, but are they getting some sort of a passcode sent to their phone, right? Or do they have the Authenticator app on their phone for yes or no, this is them? Oftentimes, I'll just kind of draw the analogy to banking, right? We see that most people, you want to transmit some kind of a banking transaction, right? You have that multi-factor authentication, they call it, or two-factor authentication set up on their devices or on their accounts, that is, right? I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to bring it up again because it's, I think, probably the single most important thing. People really need to understand that if a breach is going to take place, a compromise is going to take place. I mentioned it earlier. It's most likely going to happen through an end user clicking on a link, not really thinking, hovering over. So, education really has to address that. Needs to spend a lot of time ad nauseum on safe practices with email, thinking before you click. Do you have campaigns that you send out, right? Just awareness campaigns that you send out in emails regarding thinking before you click, hovering over a link before you click. But, I felt so strongly in my organization that our end users should not be opening anything from somebody that they don't know, right? That we had a policy on it, that it's strictly prohibited, right? So if you're not expecting an email, I would even go as far as saying if you get an email from somebody that you know, and it's saying, hey, check out this document, and it wasn't requested, and it's out of the blue, ask them, did they send it? You don't know if their account was compromised and somebody has control of their account and is sending something. It'll take you a minute, right? Call them, send them a text message, right? If you send them a reply email, who knows if it's a bad guy and their account was compromised, they could say, yeah, it's me, right? So I would look at just verifying. You have to kind of take this approach, right? This very, very vigilant approach to email communications. All right, I've covered a lot, and we're at it looks like we have about 7 or 8 minutes for some questions. And I will say, full disclosure, I don't claim to have the answers to everything here. If I can't answer your question, I'm going to tell you. But what I will do is I will get back to you. I can take it offline with you and certainly follow up. With that, Jackie, do we have any questions?
Thanks, Mike. That presentation was amazing. It's really great to hear all this information. One of the questions that we had before the webinar was how do startup companies protect information that is passed, but how do they protect their clients' information? So if a company has an e-commerce site, how do they protect their clients' information that is put through their e-commerce site, through their ordering process, and even potentially tracking for their order, even if it's going over borders?
Yeah, I know. This is, and I was thinking about this, and it's a really good question. And, it comes down to a lot of like I kind of spent a little time earlier on technical controls, right? And building this with an eye towards protecting data, right? And looking at whoever it is that you're working with, whether it's e-commerce or not, when you're sharing sensitive information, non-public information like that, right? You need to gain assurances, right, of the controls that they have in place. There's different types of encryption protocols too, right, that need to be in place. So I would venture to say that you should be looking for different types of security certifications that the businesses have that you're working with, right, around PCI, right, payment card industry certifications, PCI DSS. If you don't know what that is, just Google that. There's a ton of information on PCI DSS, right? I would imagine that you have somewhat of an understanding of that, but certainly this starts at the procurement process, right? At the procurement stage of a relationship. And, I was talking earlier before this presentation with an organization, and they said, yeah, we have a robust vendor management program in place. And, we send out periodic questionnaires for them to attest to the controls that they have in place. And, and then my question kind of came back to, that's great. You have two types of business relationships. You have these legacy, already established business relationships, and then you also have new business relationships. What are you doing the same types of inquiries at the beginning, at the very beginning? Oftentimes I say, and I would see this, right, where a contract is signed, then, oh, by the way, cybersecurity is an afterthought. Oops, we signed a contract with them. We're going to be spinning up this service. Can you do a review of their security? Well, it's a little too late now, right? We signed this contract with them, right? So I'd encourage you to, at the very beginning, do these evaluations around the types of controls that they have in place. What are they doing to safeguard your data?
And then another question that we had that that you had pretty much kind of already touched on from Howard in the chat box he said, should authentication add a long delay if credentials are invalid? And about three is long successful verifications to get it right.
Say, I'm not following. I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
Sure. So it says, should an authentication add a long delay if credentials are invalid?
The credential? No, I wouldn't. That's a good question, actually. So if I'm understanding that, if credentials are invalid, you saying should we delay them, like give them a timeout so that they can't log in until we figure out what it is? Is this legit? Did they just fat finger their authentication here? Did they just forget it? Are they having a bad day, right? I'm of the mindset that I'd be a little bit more restrictive. Again, that's a business decision. You have to look at the nature of the business and how critical is it that is time of the essence for them to get in. In the healthcare setting, we if I'm understanding the question correctly, in the healthcare setting, we approach this quite a bit with clinicians, right? They're on the floor and they're with the patient and they need to be able to get into a medical record, right? Well, they don't want to hear that their account has been locked out for 15 minutes. So we would do that. I didn't really talk about exception policies, but there is always, right? There's always an avenue for an exception to the policy. Right. What I hate is when I see exceptions baked right into the policy. I build out an exception policy for the organization, and there's a whole protocol, right, that the organization would have to follow, so that you can demonstrate if, God forbid, something bad happens. Well, but there was an exception. That was an exception. We allowed that. That's why this happened. Well, what was the process, the decision-making process to allow for that exception? Right, you need to be able to demonstrate that. And so I'm only saying that because there are exceptions, right? There may be exceptions for perhaps, I'm not saying it was at my organization, but for a clinician, right, a physician, there might be an exception. It might not be as long a lockout if they weren't able to authenticate in.
Great. Yeah, that was a great response to that question. I think it really kind of brought to light some things about getting those authentications for 3 tries. Yeah, I think that's really important. Claudia had asked if we are exploring cybersecurity measures for our contact work with the DoD, would that be a good place for our startup to be for non-government projects?
If you're exploring, say that one more time for me.
Sure. So Claudia's company is currently exploring cybersecurity measures for their contract work with the DoD. Would that be a good place for their startup to be for non-government projects?
Oh, for non-government. Yeah, right. So would what be, I guess, NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, would that be a really good place to start for informing your posture? Yes, I would say yes. I think that most would argue. Now, there's others. I didn't really touch on some of these other frameworks just because of time. But, obviously there's so many frameworks out there. I actually wrote a kind of a tongue-in-cheek piece on frameworks, and we're framework crazy. I mean, there's so many different frameworks based on the industries that you're in, and, it's incredible. But yeah, you can look at, ISO 27K too, right? ISO 27K. That's another one you could Google, the 27,000 series. You could look there. And healthcare, there's, so based on the industry, right? You have High Trust, right? High Trust is, now they're not a government agent, they're not a government framework here, right? Or but I know that they are quite a popular framework that is used, or for certification, actually. A lot of organizations too want a certification, right? And I know we're kind of going over a little here, or a minute over, but I would just look at NIST 853 is fantastic to kind of help develop and ask the right questions, or NIST CSF.
So, Mike, it's Marnie chiming in. So, Claudia specifically mentioned CMMC, Level 1.
C.
I don't know if that's familiar to you.
Yeah, yes, it is familiar. I was just speaking with somebody on that, and that's that's getting quite a bit of attention now. There's some interesting, tricky kind of requirements to CMMC, and in terms of data staying within the country, and can you attest that none of the data is leaving the country? That it's a little. I would like to take that offline if somebody wants to reach out to me. I just had this conversation with another organization, and I have been reading up on this quite a bit more, so I have some familiarity with it. So sorry, I don't have an answer for you.
No, that's really helpful, and I want to thank John for actually adding a cybersecurity NIST link from NIST.gov.
Oh, cool.
So another great reference.
Cool.
Yeah, we're really, we really appreciate your presentation today, and we encourage those who joined us today to actually share any of these links. We will share them on our Slack channel that we use for our client companies, our portfolio companies, as well as for our entrepreneurs and residents, because these are just ever evolving and important resources. So I want to thank you, and I would guess, Mike, by sharing your phone and your email address, you're open to hearing from some of the folks who've joined us today?
Yeah, great. Well, I appreciate everybody, listening in, and I hope this was helpful. If I always say if you can get one or two nuggets of information to take back with you, I'm happy. So hopefully that's the case.
Great, and if others have follow-up information, you see Mike's phone number and email address, so we certainly encourage you to reach out. We're very proud to have the Beckage firm's headquarters right here in Western New York, so we're pleased you joined us from New Jersey, and we hope you stay safe, stay well, and everyone on the call and the webinar as well. Thanks again. Thanks again, Jackie, for organizing.
All right, take care. Be safe, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.